China releases a blueprint for building a global community and tackling today's challenges. Hello, I'm Ahmed, and this is The Heat. The Chinese government has released a white paper with its vision for global development. The document comes at a time when the world is facing daunting challenges like climate change and conflicts. We will get to that in a moment, but first, the outbreak of war between the Israelis and Palestinians. The Chinese Foreign Ministry had this to say.
The only way out of the recurring Palestinian-Israeli conflict is to resume peace talks, implement the two-state solution, push for a comprehensive and proper settlement of the Palestinian issue through political means at an early date, and address the legitimate concerns of all parties. China will continue to work tirelessly with the international community to this end.
We have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. From Shanghai, Zoon Ahmed Khan is a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. From Beijing, Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Liang is chair professor in economics at Willamette University. She joins us from Portland. And from Sao Paulo, Gilson Schwartz is professor of economics at the University of Sao Paulo. Welcome to all of you. Zoon, let me start with you, and let's talk about the situation in the Middle East right now, this latest outbreak of violence in the region. China, of course, has been working very actively to bring peace to the region. It wasn't so long ago that Beijing brokered the lowering of tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So how is China viewing these latest developments between the Israelis and the Palestinians, especially in view of the fact that Israel has now said that its goal is to cut off all supplies of food, fuel, water and electricity to the 2 million people in Gaza, which includes about 1 million children?
Thank you, Anand, for having me on the panel. And these last few days have definitely been very stressful, to witness the escalation of violence. According to latest data, the death toll has exceeded maybe 1,500 on both sides. So, of course, for anyone viewing this situation, and in particular also, like you mentioned, the announcement to cut off complete ties to the Gaza Strip, which has already suffered intense human rights injustices. That said, the statement made by the Foreign Affairs Office of the Chinese government is definitely completely in line with China's stance. And China's stance is also completely in line with the vision of the Global Security Initiative, that in the end, a two-state solution is the only way forward towards lasting peace. And that is something that China has consistently supported. We have seen in recent years, in just this year, the Saudi-Iran detente as well, which has been a positive development from due to China's contributions. And we see that China also has relations with both Palestine and Israel. And that makes China, an ideal player, an ideal country to be able to have dialogue on both sides. So for sure, this is an extremely unfortunate situation. And for countries, that are calling for we have seen the kind of statements that have come out in the last couple of days, and most of them are very unfortunate. China will not take such a stance. For China, for the Chinese people, I've spoken to a few scholars as well, normal Chinese people. This is a conflict, this is an escalation that is a result of decades of injustice, of hostilities, of the inability and the lack of will from countries that had the capacity to reduce the violence and lead to a lasting solution. So for sure, China stands by the 1967 borders. China stands by a lasting solution. China condemns deaths on both sides. Anyone should, everyone should. Civilians and children shouldn't die. But at the same time, there is a deep recognition of the fact that this is decades of a conflict, of injustices, of misunderstandings that can only be resolved through dialogue and through a lasting solution, which is the two-state solution.
Einar Tangen, the leader in the United States Senate, the Democrat Chuck Schumer, he's in China right now. He's been holding talks with Chinese officials. He was asked about the outbreak of hostilities in the Middle East. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
I urge you and the Chinese people to stand with the Israeli people and condemn these cowardly and vicious attacks. I was very disappointed, to be honest, by the foreign ministry statement that showed no sympathy or support for Israel during these troubled times.
So listening to Chuck Schumer there, Einar, the inference is that China must follow the Western line, the Western view on what is happening in the Middle East right now. What do you make of that?
Well, I think a lot of people in China would disagree. The Western view has been to stand idly by while basically Israel has been trying to eradicate the West Bank. This is unacceptable. It's not part of a two-state solution. Now, there are no heroes in this particular conflict. There are only victims. It has been very difficult to deal with a Palestinian Authority that is split between Hamas and Fatah. One says yes, the other says no. But on the other hand, the idea that Israel can perpetuate this, in essence, eradication of all Palestinians from within what they want to call the new Israel. You'll recall there was a map that was put out by Netanyahu at the United Nations showing that there would be no West Bank, that it would just be basically Gaza, and that would all be Israel. They have moved very far away from this two-state solution, and Washington has stood idly by as children are being killed, as journalists are being shot. There have been no repercussions. Now, all of a sudden, it is everybody should be showing sympathy for the power that has, in essence, become a aggressive, onerous, dictatorial power. It doesn't mean that Palestine is correct. It simply means that this is something that needs to be discussed, where countries need to come together, as Zoon said, and discuss and make sure that there is a clear path for both sides. Otherwise, we're going to be locked in this kind of battle forever.
Gilson, Schwartz, Brazil has just assumed the presidency of the United Nations Security Council. It's called for an emergency meeting to address the situation in the Middle East. Up to now, if we look at this conflict, and it has been a decades-long conflict, up to now, the main players have been the major Western powers. But if we look at the call by Brazil, what kind of clout can the global South, especially a country like Brazil, bring to resolving this?
Well, I think that the Lula government has been trying to reposition Brazil in the global scene. We know that Brazil is part of the BRICS initiative. Our former president, Dilma Rousseff, is now president of the BRICS Bank. So I think there are funds, there are resources, there is a will to support peacemaking processes among the nations of the South. But let me also stress that there has already been a very important, although it's only 3 days, there's already been a very important political change in Israel, a change that has not taken place on the side of the Palestinians. And this change is the fact that we have seen very quickly the formation of a coalition government. So Benjamin Netanyahu is not alone anymore. We know that both Hamas and Netanyahu are against the two-state solution. They are always betting against that prospect. We've seen months and months of protests among Israeli Democrats against the theocratic will of Benjamin Netanyahu. Over the last couple of days, there has been a change. So Israel now is united, but that doesn't mean united with Netanyahu. That means that the opposition has come to join the government, so that increases the likelihood of a two-state solution coming back to the negotiation table. And I think that with respect to Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, there is two states, actually, two Palestinian states, and that it's very difficult to see that Hamas will continue to play an important role in this war or in this geopolitical game. I think that there are political changes that are taking place very quickly, and Israel is already under a new government, a new coalition, formed for an emergency. But of course, those guys who are now joining the government are exactly those that are against Netanyahu and are for a two-state solution. So we should also look to what's actually taking place in the political scene, because war is just politics, and politics is war in a peaceful way. So I think that there has been changes, and I don't think that there will be a massacre of Palestinians in Gaza that will be completely dumb. So I think that the political way is quite open now, and unfortunately, it's taking hundreds of innocent people's lives. But in the long run, this will be remembered as a change in the situation of the Israeli government towards a two-state solution quickly.
Liang, I'm going to turn the corner now and look at China's vision for the world, its economic future, and actually talk about another aspect of Chuck Schumer's visit to China. Chuck Schumer, of course, the Democratic leader in the United States Senate. He is the latest in a long line of people from the Biden administration that's made their way to China for talks. The Treasury Secretary has been there, the Commerce Secretary has been there. Of course, it all started off with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who went there, and John Kerry, the climate envoy, has been there as well. What's behind all these visits? And it's been a one-way trip. It's been Americans going to China. You know, and all these visits are taking place at a time when the U.S. still does not lose an opportunity to criticize China.
Right, good to talk to you, Anand. So I think that's a clear indication that this U.S.-China ties, these relationships are so important for the United States, for China, and for the global economy. And therefore, you have seen this flurry of high-level cabinet members and government officials visiting China. And in the short term, I think they're preparing a potential visit of President Xi Jinping to the APEC meeting in San Francisco later this year, and may meet in person with President Biden. And over the long term, I think there's really an urgent need for both countries to really stabilize their ties and really put their relationships on the right track. So that's why I think there has been so many visits. And also, I think it's very much emphasized that this relationship should be stabilized based on economic ties, economic relationships. I think Chuck Schumer has come here to complain about the business environment, but at the same time, I think it's totally necessary for Biden administration to re-examine their approach to China. For example, they have put 600 Chinese companies on the entity list, including extra 40 of them was added last Friday. So I think when you talk about business environment, I think this is a two-way street. But when it comes to the comment that Chuck Schumer made about China's stance on Israel and Palestine a conflict, it's very counterproductive. I think it's also hypocritical. You can't expect China to take sides on the one hand, but also expect China to be the peace mediator and arbitrator. And also, I think it's very important to really see the context of the whole conflict that has been based on, decades of injustice and, I would call it colonization and human rights violations. And finally, I think it's very clear that China has always, opposed to and condemned all, attacks and violence against civilians. And so that's a very clear stance on China. And China also opposed any escalation of the violence and asked for peace negotiation. I think unlike some of the politicians simply enunciate, quote, finish them, end of quote.
Einar Tangen, let's get into the white paper that was released by Chinese officials on what the world's economic future is going to look like. It's called A Global Community of Shared Future. The paper says the zero-sum game where there are winners and losers is doomed to fail, and that countries that pursue that are a threat to the world. Explain that to us.
Well, I mean, let's put it on a positive spin here. This plan emphasizes harmony over conformity, based on shared aspirational goals of countries for prosperity, peace, and respect. In the past, the U.S. has operated post-World War II on this belief that the only way to prevent World War III was to make everybody conform to their idea of the perfect government, which is liberal democratic capitalism. But that hasn't happened. And instead of a world that is more peaceful, we have a world that is, as we have seen, more at odds with each other. It's time to change things. We have a multipolar world. It's necessary for countries to come together, but they're not going to do so based on this idea of one country dictating what the policies for other countries should be. There has to be, these common ideas. This is where the Global Development Initiative, Security Development, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, BRICS Plus. These are all indications of how countries can come together through consensus rather than being forced to.
Zoon, what are your thoughts on the white paper and the roadmap that it lays out for a more just and equitable world where we have win-win formulas for global development?
I completely resonate with what Einar just said. China's stance on global development, on the perspective that conformity, or what we say, uniformity, has not been the solution ever. And today you increasingly see, again, a multipolar world where countries across the global south in particular are more aware of what's good for them. They choose what's better for their development, and they want to prioritize pragmatic ways forward. And for China, especially when we look at the launch of the BRI, you see the GDI, GSI, GCI. I mean, all of these initiatives, all of these ideas, and the Shanghai spirit, they come together to understand that we have collective challenges, global challenges. These cannot be addressed by being disunited. No country alone has the right to dictate to others either. And we have to respect the fact that we are a diverse world. We have diverse vantage points, perspectives, and those can all align and create synergy. So for China, the way China also proceeds with developments under the BRI and other corporations, multilaterally or bilaterally with countries, it is by trying to understand the perspective of that region, of that continent, of that country, and seeing how well it can align with China's capacity to cooperate with that country and region. So all of it comes together. There's consistency in the messaging. There is consistency also with the perspective of the Bandung vision that China very clearly was a part of. And I'll also add that, when China was joining the WTO, Bill Clinton at that time, made a statement that we hope with economic liberalization will come political liberalization. I mean, they really believed that idea that this way of governance is universal. It has to be, it's inevitable for a country to move forward in the trajectory, the path that the Western countries did. But over time, we have seen that that's not precisely what happened. And on top of that, what we see is that in relative terms, the global south, China and other global south countries, their impact, their capacity to make an impact on the world, their relevance is increasing. And the relative relevance of the global north is not increasing. So I think a mindset shift is required. They need to acknowledge that this is a trajectory, and it does not mean that we cannot coexist. And I also, very quickly, I want to add that I think some of these visits by the United States, these senior officials, even Schumer's visit, I think this is a way of buying time in a way. They realize that, we need to continue our economic cooperation to a certain extent. And at the same time, you have American think tanks talking about the ultimate goal being containing China. So maybe this is a way to buy time, but the real perspective is to try and contain the inevitable.
Liang, the paper also touches on trade and the need for countries to pursue a policy of openness. It opposes things like protectionism, the erection of barriers, and of course the imposition that we've seen recently of unilateral sanctions. Do you see that happening?
Well, I think this is what the white paper would call the mega trend, the interdependence that has, really prevailed during the human history. So I think this is really the message that this white paper is trying to deliver. This is a 37-page document with 14,000 words. It really spells out very clearly China's vision going forward for the global community with a shared future, as the title suggests, but also very specific actions on China's part. So Ahmed has mentioned some of the major initiatives and also not to mention, all these free trade agreements that China has signed with countries and also country blocs. So it's clear that China wants to promote the kinds of open, inclusive, innovation-driven, and also sustainable development. And trade is part of, I think, the channels, part of the means to do that. But there is way beyond just trade. But let's talk about, BRI. That even according to World Bank, which is not the most China-friendly multilateral institutions, also agreed that if fully implemented, this BRI is going to increase the global revenues by 1.6 trillion. That's with a T, and lift 7.6 million people out of extreme poverty and another 32 million people out of the moderate poverty. So in addition, to investments, to trade, there are a lot of other corporations like technologies, also like some of the small but beautiful new initiatives and new projects that China is implementing in countering, poverty, climate change, promote renewable energies, green technologies, and so on and so forth that have already benefited 30 million people in the world. So I think China is talking the talk and walking the walk and really showing the world this shared future of a global community is doable.
Gilson, Schwartz, we live in a very polarized world right now, and we see those divisions not just between major powers, but between blocks of countries that have divisions. On the one side, we see what is collectively known as the West and its institutions like NATO, the Quad. On the other side, we have the Global South, and of course, we have, more recently, the BRICS grouping. How important is it initially for this divide to be bridged?
Well, I think that, first of all, realistically, things are going to get worse before getting better. I think that we have to realize that this is a deep institutional crisis. The whole post-war model, from the institutional perspective, and I mean also financial institutions, has just been, if not destroyed, seriously, I would say, seriously fragilized. We are now living in a fragile institutional landscape. The United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, there's all this institutional framework that was created under the hegemony of the US. This is really going to the past. It's part of history. There's no efficiency, there's no funding that is available enough to leverage a new stage of development. We must also realize that even China now faces serious challenges in terms of growth model. This has been a very strong discussion lately. How to resume growth? How could China, for instance, stimulate domestic demand as opposed to the global trade as a source of economic growth? So these questions have no easy answer. I think that, of course, protectionism is the easier way to go, but it's not a long-term solution. We need, first of all, a new institutional framework, a new global institutional framework. Is the Global South able to promote that kind of framework? How much can we actually trust the existing institutions as a bridging framework for what will come next? It's a kind of a vacuum. It's really difficult to build upon what's going down. So I think that the BRICS initiative is really part of the answer. Yeah. We've seen also discussions about creating a currency or using other currencies, like Brazil is already trading with China using other currencies that are internal to this alliance. Right. So I think that new financial institutions and political institutions are needed. Are they being built right now? I think yes, but it will take time, and the old model will have to be destroyed. That's realistically, in my perspective, a very bleak horizon, so things probably will get worse before getting better.
Einar, I'm going to get back to something that Zoon was talking about a moment ago, and that is the way the United States sees China. If we listen to Biden administration officials, they seem to be engaging in some kind of verbal gymnastics here. Decoupling has become de-risking, but it's, how do you see that? Is this just sort of words just used to cover the fact that what they really want to do is contain China?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the problem is the U.S. believes that they're helping China and the world by containing it. I've talked to officials in the past and currently, and they say, well, China's out of control. We're simply helping China adjust to the world order. Well, I think they tried to help Japan do the same thing, and we saw what happened in '86 when they signed the Plaza Accord. So, you know, at this juncture, I mean, you have them saying, you know, conflicting things. Well, at first, they want to decouple. Well, fine, all right. Then they want to de-risk. These are semantics. But the truth is, Schumer came over to China to say, oh, you're not fair to us. You know, you should be opening your markets. You know, you should be allowing Micron to sell chips, although we don't want to, you know, have any investment or allow any Americans to do it. We just want to profit from sales to you. We don't really want to cooperate. So this is an internal contradiction within the United States. It's something that is on display to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And it's something where, you know, you're starting to see this deep division that some of my colleagues have reference between the global south, 152 developing countries plus a number of others, and the established global north, who seem intent on keeping everything they possibly can to themselves. The main difference here, though, in what China brings to the table is 10 years and $1 trillion of investment, not frameworks, not talk in the future, but some things that have actually happened and created value for these countries.
Liang, there's one development worth looking at, and if we could do this really quickly because we're running out of time, but there was a report put out by the U.S. Commerce Department which says that the volume of goods imported by the United States from China has dropped 25% in the 6 months from January to July this year. That's in comparison to the same period last year. So China has lost its position as the main supplier of goods to the United States. It has increased exports to ASEAN countries, though, but here in the United States, the main suppliers are now Canada and Mexico. Is this just an outlier, or do you see this as a trend?
Well, I think it's it's too early to tell, but it is clear that, you know, this whole idea of de-risking, reshoring, and friendshoring definitely has a short-term impact on, you know, the China's trade and investment configurations. But I think it remains to be seen if that trend sustains, because after all, I don't think it's very easy to really, you know, find a second China as an alternative, not to mention all the economic costs. They're going to be self-inflicted. But I just want to add quickly the one last point based on what we just talked about. I think there's a very beautiful line in that white paper that says, quote, risk prevention and cooperation are not mutually contradictory, whereas non-cooperation is the biggest risk and non-development is the biggest threat to security. Pursuing de-synicization in the de-risking and reducing dependence undermines opportunities, cooperation, stability, and development. And I think that really speaks volume to the current situation.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Ahmed in Washington, D.C.